I'm Zachary Kipping, for anyone I haven't talked to yet as you popped in. We're going to be talking about NgRx today, if that isn't obvious from our title screen. But with that, let's go ahead and get started, shall we? Oops. So, as most front-end developers are probably aware, managing and interfacing with state can be one of the larger complexities you have to deal with in any given code base, any given project, besides possibly trying to center things with CSS, right? So these complexities of state management can often bring frustration and be a large source of spaghetti code with their kind of custom solutions and custom hacks. And sure, these kinds of solutions may work. They may do all the stuff you need them to, feature-wise and all that, but is a headache of having to support that and do knowledge transfers on these custom solutions really worth the extra time and effort into building them? Well, today we're going to be taking a look at NgRx, whose development team has kind of put a large focus on solving these larger complexities surrounding state management. So along those lines, here's kind of going to be the roadmap for the next 30 to 40 minutes we're going to spend together. Before we get too deep into that, I just kind of want to talk about Oasis Digital here real quick. We are a company that is one part software consulting and another part just team training, organization training. We do a lot of consulting on enterprise and otherwise software projects, mostly on the front end with Angular and other SPA application frameworks. We take that knowledge, take those best practices, take those expertise that we develop there, and start producing a lot of curriculum and other types of training and public events like the thing you are attending today. Right, and without further ado, let's go ahead and take a look at this roadmap. So first off, we're going to be taking a look at how NgRx can kind of bring a meaningful impact to your projects, your teams, and your organization as a whole. We'll also be taking a look at how the actual underlying patterns back in NgRx allow it to address a lot of these complexities of state management that we'll kind of be talking about here in a bit. After that, we'll take a quick look at some code snippets. I won't be diving too deep into the weeds because it's not really about what this event is about, but we will be taking a look at kind of the day-to-day code snippets you might see as you're working on your projects and whatnot. We'll also be discussing a little bit of how NgRx kind of pans out in the real world, the types of applications it works well with, and kind of the general scenarios I've seen NgRx used well with, and how that kind of pans out. We'll have a little bit of demo architecture and UI to help explain that, but it'll be kind of a quick little shindig there. And since essentially nothing is perfect in the front-end development world, regardless of what our wishes are, we'll be taking a look at some of the caveats and trade-offs of using NgRx. And this will be kind of based on prior projects that we've used NgRx in. So coming from our kind of our expertise and stuff there. And then of course, finally, we'll wrap up with some Q&A. Zoom has a special Q&A feature. There should be a little Q&A button on the top of your screen. Feel free to post questions and things like that in there as they kind of come up. We'll go through that list as things progress and kind of wrap that up at the end. Okay, let's get started with the actual content, shall we? So let's take a look at some of the major impacts that NgRx kind of brings to the table here. So starting off, NgRx brings sort of a unified API for how to deal with your state to any given project. This API kind of allows you to approach things such as data reading and displaying, triggering and performance of your business logic, interacting with your backends and your asynchronous events, and then sharing of data across the application in a drastically more straightforward manner that kind of results in a lot less headaches and whatnot. So NgRx takes away a lot of the kind of overhead and allows for developers to focus on what really matters to them, doing their features, trying to get work done, less about all the general overhead of how do all these components work together and all that junk. So not only does it make your code base for a single project more or less consistent, but it makes your developers and your teams more consistent as well. So when a project ends or people need to move internally within the company or whatever, the transitions can be vastly easier. Now, a large source of strain for any developer new to a team or project, or even an organization as a whole, is actually having to learn the ins and outs of their custom solutions, along with whatever the actual problem domains are as well. Now, having NgRx remove even just kind of the headache of large custom solutions for state management allows for members of teams to be onboarded a lot faster. They kind of know where to look and how to interface with the NgRx API already, and can kind of focus on learning and solving the problem domain itself, working on their features and getting all that stuff kind of just done. Because this API is kind of more unified and consistent, scaling on the part of the code base and the actual team and organization itself becomes a lot easier. So a lot of times we can see this by just tacking on an additional requirement of knowing NgRx when you're hiring people, moving people on the teams, or even just allowing people, the developers themselves, to train on NgRx a little bit before onboarding onto a new project. This allows for teams and projects to kind of grow with a lot more ease. And this is mostly because team experts, the people that have been on the team for a long time, really know the problem domain, kind of know the code in and out. They don't have to handhold people as much. Newer members can kind of just get in, get going, start providing meaningful contributions fast. Since they already know the API, they just need to work on the actual problem domain, the features themselves. Later, we'll kind of take a look at where some code snippets, where we'll be able to see kind of where the code readability and complexity splitting play out a little bit more. But for now, just know that NgRx goes to pretty great lengths to split the processes of dealing with state management into more bite-sized pieces, more or less, that leads to your code base being more organized and also just easier to integrate with. Now, moving on to the actual patterns, right? So I've done my general spiel of NgRx at this point. So hopefully that's hooked everyone into possibly taking a deeper look at this, getting into it, and maybe making use of it, right? So what are the patterns? So the patterns back in NgRx are mostly based on a reactive nature of Angular, right? So, and also dealing with state management under the hood with RxJS. They do this while trying to expose a more synchronous and streamlined API where they can to make the everyday development life a little bit easier. So instead of developers having to run their own services with observables, subjects, behavior subjects, all that stuff from RxJS, right? All the very, very complicated stuff you don't really want to have to deal with. They can make use of whatever NgRx provides to kind of sidestep a lot of that upfront complexity in dealing with asynchronous data and managing state within their application. Now, a lot of developers probably just had some really bad flashbacks when I mentioned both asynchronous data and state management within the same sentence. Now, thankfully, providing an interface for these two complexities is a vital part of what NgRx has become. So hopefully we can kind of dash away those bad flashbacks and move more towards something that's actually helping you reduce a lot of the magic that surrounds these two topics. Now, how does NgRx actually help to remove this magic, help remove all this kind of overhead in dealing with asynchronous data and state management? Well, it starts off by making use of something called the Redux Pattern. It's basically an implementation of the Redux Pattern, making use of Angular and RxJS at the same time. It ends up being kind of a synchronous state machine driven approach to dealing with events and data flowing through your actual systems. The Redux pattern itself actually kind of originated out of Facebook's React framework ecosystem, just as kind of a tidbit, but it's been mostly kind of adapted to a lot of other development systems and frameworks as well, including Angular, of course. So the state machine concept I mentioned is mostly the main driving factor here for the Redux pattern that NgRx is trying to implement. I'm going to kind of dive into explaining that pattern here with this diagram you can see on the screen. So with this diagram, I'm going to kind of start in the lower left-hand corner with components. Components are kind of the building blocks of Angular for the most part in terms of putting stuff on the UI and getting interaction out from users. So it's kind of a good starting point. Now, I mentioned two important things there of components. You put stuff onto the screen, you render stuff, and you get events out from the user, the person actually interacting with your template, your components. And you can kind of see how there's two arrows going in and out of the component. So we're going to focus on the out for now, which is essentially the user trying to trigger some business logic, trigger some type of data manipulation or events inside your application, right? They click on a button, they type some stuff into input, whatever. This is typically where a component would dispatch something called an action. And as the action is named, you're basically just trying to perform business logic, some type of stuff within your system. So with this Redux pattern, we start in our component whenever the user wants to do something we dispatch an action. Actions are kind of like maybe like creating to-dos, deleting to-dos, editing to-dos, stuff like that, right? Kind of named that way. We'll see code snippets of this stuff later. And these actions eventually get picked up by this next thing called the reducer. Typically, your application will have multiple reducers. Reducers basically just take in whatever the current state of your application is for a certain chunk. Maybe I'm looking at like a to-do list, or I'm looking at my user authentication object or whatever. And it'll combine that current chunk of state with whatever actions are flowing through it, and it'll produce a new result. And that new results get stored inside the store. So that next part of the chain there. So again, starting in the component, dispatching actions because we want to do something inside of our application, right? We're very spa oriented. Let's actually do something, be interactive. Our reducers pick up those actions, produce a new state of the world for our store to kind of hand out to whoever needs it. So our store there is kind of like our central repository for data in our application, kind of our global system of data, our global shared state. Now, the next part of this chain is getting data out of our store, getting data to the component and onto our screen, rendering it, doing whatever stuff we need to do with that data. So the next chunk here after the store is looking at the selectors. So selectors are basically the component's way of selecting what part of the state it actually wants to look at and get new events out for the changes in state. So if a component wants to select like the to-do list, for example, using a selector, it can grab that chunk of state from the store, and whenever any reducers produce a new state for the to-do list, the component will be made aware. It's given that new data. It can display it in a table, it can display it in a list, do whatever it needs to do with that data. So it kind of ends up with this kind of cyclical pattern here, kind of like a state machine, right? Components dispatch actions, reducers pick up those actions, produce new state, selectors take that new state, hand it off to the component, and we keep going in that fun little cycle of users responding to the changes in the template, making more changes themselves, triggering more actions, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Now, the state machine and kind of the synchronous approach is all fine and dandy, but what happens if I actually need to do some asynchronous logic, right? Maybe I need to go to a backend, maybe I need to interact with like a socket connection, maybe I need to do other stuff, right? Just asynchronous data is a part of the front end nowadays, so we might as well get used to it. So how do we do that? Well, you can probably see that little side branch there next to the action. This is where our asynchronous stuff kind of lives inside of our NgRx system here. So what we can do is whenever we want to go like interact with an API or something, like maybe I want to go fetch the latest to-dos from my backend, my database. Well, I can have my component or service or whatever dispatch an action. And instead of going to the reducers, it'll actually go to this chunk called the effects. And these effects are aptly named. They're basically side effects for your synchronous state machine here. And these side effects allow you to interact with a data layer service, an API, backend, whatever, produce some type of result, right? Maybe getting some JSON back from a database or API, crafting a whole new action, and then dispatching that back into your main little state machine there. So again, component dispatching an action or whatever, dispatching an action. Your effect does, it's like asynchronous business logic, crunches those numbers, gets that data out of the backend, whatever, and then eventually produces another action to kind of go back into the synchronous state machine system here once it's done with its asynchronous logic, right? So we have that fun little main loop there, and then we have our side effects as well. And that more or less deals with like 99% of cases with NgRx. And we'll take a look at a few cases where that doesn't. All right, so now that we've taken a look at the patterns, the next main thing will be probably taking a look at code snippets, but I do want to take a very small break just to kind of take a look at our upcoming schedule and some of the offerings that Oasis Digital has, just before anyone gets too bored about me just spouting NgRx stuff. I'm gonna go ahead and click into and look at our Oasis Digital website here. I'm gonna go and bring this onto my main screen here and resume my sharing. All right, so this is our Oasis Digital website. Oasis Digital itself, I mentioned, does a lot of public events, a lot of training and stuff. So this is our current upcoming schedule. Yes, just yesterday we had an advanced Angular lunch. It was on Storybook. It was a lot of fun by Nathan. Today we're obviously doing our NgRx stuff. Just after this and 3 Central, so right after this NgRx event, we have our Angular Clinic, which is an awesome time to kind of pop in, get some questions answered from experts at our company, which is a Google Meet. If you click on that link, you can pop in there. It's completely free. You can get us to kind of help your questions and whatnot. Don't want to get you in trouble with your job or whatever, so don't do any like customer proprietary information. But if we can help you out, just answer questions and all this stuff, then awesome. Someone even just mentioned Angular Bootcamp, right? That's completely sold out, but no worries. We always have more Angular Bootcamps popping up. We have one in April. We also have the Angular for Architects beta later in March as well. The first run of that went really, really well by Paul Spears. Actually can't wait to see the next one and see how it goes even better, hopefully. Don't want to set them up too bad. But we also have our Code Talk Teach as well. It's kind of like a podcast style type of thing. It's a lot of fun. I usually put it up in the background while I'm working as well. Don't tell my boss. And it's kind of just a nice commentary analysis, Angular front end stuff. So it's kind of nice to just pop in, see what's going on. We talk about various different topics in depth as well. So it's a nice little round out of that stuff. All right, also as a side note, we do more training, not just on Angular. We do specific training on NgRx, RxJS, Cypress, unit testing, all this stuff. So kind of the conglomerate of front-end stuff. We do a lot of training on that as well. And as a side note, if you didn't see my contact information on that first slide with the fun little gift there from Parks and Rec, here's my information again if you need to contact me, if you have any questions about any of the stuff I go over today, or just want to reach out, say hello, get into contact with me and with us at Oasis Digital, feel free to contact me by email, LinkedIn, Twitter. If you want to make an issue on one of my GitHub projects, feel free to do that too, whatever floats your boat. All right, so let's move on. And to kind of take a look at some of the code snippets. Now, obviously this isn't code on the screen, but it is pretty important. So this is kind of the master list, more or less, of all the libraries under the head of NgRx. So NgRx is more than just these things called the store and effects and all this stuff. It's kind of like a giant conglomerate monorepo of various different libraries. The first of which on the core side, you can probably see our store and effects. Those are the main ones we're making use of in our little diagram there, right? The store is that kind of central integral state machine system, and the effects bring in those side effects, that side branch we saw in our diagram. And then the dev tools down at the bottom of the core there kind of allow you to, gives you a set of tools and stuff with the Redux dev tools, which is an extension on most browsers, Chrome, Firefox, all that good stuff. Kind of allows you to do just development stuff on your actual browser when you're running your applications. You can kind of rewind history, set history, look at the store, see what actions are flowing through it. It's a really, really nice dev tool to set up with your Angular projects as well. If you're using NgRx, I really recommend it. I kind of include that in the core because it's one of the go-to things you usually do when you set your stuff up. Now on the additional libraries side, a lot of these I just kind of make use of anyways, but I call them additional because they're not a part of the core, more or less. One awesome one though is called Router Store. Router Store kind of allows you to integrate pretty seamlessly with all your routing state, right? So Angular itself just naturally has some state management techniques with routing and forms and all that stuff. Router Store allows you to just kind of seamlessly integrate with query params, rep params, all that good stuff, and bring them into your actual store system as well. Gives you some extra actions, some extra selectors, all that good stuff. NgRx Entity is a kind of fun extension, I guess, to the API that is NgRx Store. It allows you to kind of sidestep a lot of the complexity and hassle of dealing with like large lists of data, right? Which is pretty common in a lot of CRUD applications. You have lists of data that you might add to, you might remove from, you might edit things inside that list, etc. Entity allows you to basically just sidestep a lot of that, use a lot of their custom function handlers to do things in a very performant and efficient way without having to like write code over and over and over again in your producers. Won't dive too deep into Entity in this, but that's just kind of my general spiel on it. Feel free to look at the docs, or we go on it pretty deep in our NgRx class as well. So feel free to look at that as well. And the last one I want to mention here is NgRx/data. It's pretty good. I've never used it too much personally, but basically it's kind of like another extension API, kind of like Entity, that allows you to more or less integrate easily with your backend solutions. So if you want to kind of persist and sync up your front-end cache, your actual router store data with your backend data. Kind of helps you with that, gives you some more functionality and ease of use stuff there as well. So a lot of stuff here, store effects, all that good stuff in the core. And then there's also some additional libraries and APIs that help you even further with your NgRx experience as well. Now I'm going to take a drink of water real quick, but then we'll move on to taking a look at the actual code for actions themselves, kind of the building block of NgRx. Okay, so hopefully this code on the screen isn't too scary. There'll be a couple slides here. I just kind of throw code onto the screen. Don't panic too much. We'll try and walk through it as much as possible. Just kind of line by line, snippet by snippet. So earlier I mentioned actions are kind of your way of performing business logic, performing transformations on your global state inside your NgRx store, right? Actions get picked up a reducer, it's dispatched by components or other stuff. So they're kind of the main building block for what can you do inside your application. And here, the easiest way to create actions within NgRx nowadays with the modern API is making use of the create action function coming from NgRx/store. And as the function name says, you're literally creating an action by calling this function. And the first parameter you have to give it is a unique string ID. This ID usually has a bit of micro-syntax to it, at least what I've mostly seen from the projects I've been on. By micro-syntax, I just mean like it has some very specific chunks of the string that are kind of pertinent to making it unique. And the first part of that string, you can kind of see there in the square brackets there, it has the to-do list. And that to-do list is kind of what the feature the action belongs to. In our case, if you had multiple features, to-do list, off, other junk, right, some other state in your global browser, the to-do list action here would resolve into that feature. And then create to-do there is just literally naming the action as well. So I have a create to-do action in my to-do list feature. That's pretty much all that means. And then the second parameter there, the props function that's being called, is a little bit of a weird one. You're not really passing anything to that props function. You're more or less using it as a placeholder for adding some kind of typing information to your action here. So actions don't just have to be an ID, right? You can actually pass data along with your actions, pass some payloads along with your actions. Like if I'm creating a to-do, maybe I want to grab some state from a form or whatever, like a title and description, and maybe the ID of the user from the off state, whatever. You can throw that stuff onto the action whenever you use it, dispatch it. And this is how we add that typing information in here. So in our case, we have this props function call, and we add our little interface or object typing between those open and closing carets there. Now, you don't have to do this. You don't have to make a full interface for this typing. I do it because I like to make as much full use of TypeScript as possible, right? And essentially, you make that interface, you can use that interface in your components when you're dispatching an action, make your life a little bit easier in the form of typing, etc. And Victor just asked, which I'm going to go ahead and answer this because it's kind of a softball question. So he said, actions are CRUD operations to the state. Essentially, yeah, it could be any type of operations, any type of business logic you need to perform on your state are being kind of spawned off by dispatching actions into your system, right? Whenever a user wants to do something, they dispatch an action, right? Clicking on a button dispatches an action, maybe typing into a form input or something for filtering or sorting dispatches actions. Yeah, user interaction dispatches actions, perform CRUD operations, perform other types of business logic, maybe turning a Boolean from true to false if you want to hide something, whatever it needs to be, right? Whatever the business logic of your feature is. Usually takes place in the form of an action. You usually have one action per instance of work in your application. You want to have a good, the term the NgRx team usually refer to as good action hygiene. Basically just having one action per whatever you're doing, right? You don't want to use one action for multiple different types of business logic. You want to have one action for everything. That way you can absolutely 100% tell when you're rewinding history or whatever through your state machine, what's happening, why is it happening, etc. All right, so those are actions. The next step here is taking a look at the reducers, which again, reducers take those actions, take the current state and perform and produce a new state based on some business logic or whatever functionality you have for your application. So much like the ease of use function of the create action you're getting from NgRx store, reducers have a create reducer function as well. So it's pretty straightforward and simple. So the create reducer oftentimes takes in a kind of generic typing there between the open and closing carets. That's basically just stating like what data is going to be flowing through this reducer, right? What's the old state? What's going to be the new state? In my case, for this to-do list reducer, it's going to be managing a list of to-dos, so an array of to-do objects. And that could be it could be an object, it could be an array, it could even be a Boolean, whatever you need that data to be in your global state for this feature state. Right, in the actual function call, you have several parameters you need to pass in. The first of which is going to be the initial state of your reducer. So in my case, I have a to-do list. Empty array is an awesome, perfect example of state for that as a default. And then past that, we have kind of our switch cases. So the cases that our reducer is actually going to do something and perform some work. And we're kind of switching on the actions that are flowing through our reducer. I might not have mentioned it earlier, but all actions flow through all reducers. So in our case, when we're creating a reducer, we have to actually specify what actions are we actually going to perform business logic on, and the rest of them just kind of get ignored. So in our case, for my to-do list reducer, I'm paying attention to the create to-do action and the delete to-do action. And then that to-do actions there is just a combination of all my actions from a different file. Right, so that's the first argument of that on function we're getting from NgRx store. So when we get an action that is of type create to do, we're going to perform some business logic. Or if we get a typing of delete to do, we're going to perform some business logic. The next parameter of that on function is the actual business logic going to be performed, right? So you get access to the old state, so the current state of your store for that, that entity, that object, that array of data, or whatever you're looking at. And then you also get access to the payload and the action itself in the second parameter. I'm doing a little bit of object destructuring there because I don't care about the entire action. I just care about the data inside of it. So I'm just doing a little bit of destructuring on that second parameter there. And then ultimately, this function here, this arrow function you see in the second parameter needs to return back some data matching the to-do array typing. So I'm just returning back an array spread of the old state plus a new object, right? So just adding in that new create to-do object to our list. And this is kind of a little bit of pseudocode, so don't pay too much attention to the actual business logic, but more or less you're just given a function you can run, you're given the old state and the action payload, and you can perform your business logic and produce a result, return back a result. Often what I recommend, what I've seen in a lot of projects is actually just making pure TypeScript functions for that arrow function. This way you don't actually have to test your entire reducer, right? Test the actual NgRx logic of when this action runs, do this, blah, blah, blah. You can actually just straight up test your business logic of the reducer by extracting out that function to a pure function. The delete to-do handler down there is a little bit of an example of that. First parameter would be the state. Second parameter is that payload, if you have one, on your action, and then you just return back some state from there. Right? That facilitates a little bit easier unit testing, et cetera, as well. Again, just pure TypeScript from here on out. Okay. Now that we have our reducers kind of producing our state from our actions, the next step is to try and get stuff out of the store, right? I want my components to be able to read data out of the store and display onto the screen. So the first line of that is taking a look at our selectors. Now, selectors are a little bit interesting. They allow you to kind of point in and say what part of the state does this constant kind of look at from your global state. In our case, we're creating a feature selector first. So our select to-dos constant there is going to be a feature selector for the to-do state. So my app state here is basically just an object with a to-do property and then has that list of to-dos as an array there. So from our app state, we're plucking out the to-dos array list, and then that's our first line of selector, right? We're selecting that global state out of our app state and doing other stuff with it as well. Here's where the kind of the chaining functionality of selectors starts up. So we start with our feature selector. That's kind of our base selector for getting the feature state out from our store. And then from there, we can kind of chain off of that to do further selections and transformations of our data, just kind of depending on what the components need for displaying stuff on their screens. There can be a lot of business logic with these selectors as well in terms of transforming the data. If you need data to be in a certain way for a table or a certain way for a different list, this can be a good time to actually produce these selectors they're very reusable across your entire application as well. So in our case, maybe I wanted to just have a selector that looks only at the length of the to-do list, right? The to-do array. So in my case, I can create a new selector, just a normal create selector, not a feature one, and use the select to-dos feature selector as a default base, and then pass it a function here, so the secondary function of grabbing the to-dos from the select to-dos feature selector, and then returning back the length of that list. At that point, I go from an array as my base to a number, right? The count of that array. So that's how we're kind of chaining those selectors. All of these are kind of memoized for the most part, and that just means the inputs are kind of cached so that if input is repeated multiple times, they're not going to be constantly crunching that business logic over and over again. It kind of saves you some performance. So using these selectors is very good performance boost for your application as well, instead of just doing that all on the component side with RxJS. Now, you can also do and pass payloads to these selectors as well. This bottom is last to do constant is kind of an example of that. It's a little bit silly, a little bit contrived example, but it does show off the fact that you can pass in payloads and kind of configuration data to these selectors if you need to in order to perform your business logic. So in the case of the is last to do, I'm going to create a selector, use the select to do count kind of as my base here. And then I can pass in my function again, just like I did with my previous selector. I get the count out because that's what's being produced by the select to do count selector. And then you see there's a second parameter there now as well. And that second parameter is actually going to be your additional configuration stuff you're passing from the component side or wherever, where you're making use of the is last to do selector. And we'll see that here in a second. In my case, I'm just passing an index, a number. You could pass in an object, an array, or whatever you need to pass in. And then I perform my business logic, which is just something kind of silly, right? Just checking to see if the count equals index plus 1. So nothing too crazy there. Business logic itself doesn't matter too much. Just taking a look at the actual syntax for passing that data into your selector. Okay, so that is selectors. That's how we actually get and select state out of our store. And then let's see how components actually make use of those selectors for displaying stuff onto the template, right? So this kind of completes our initial chain here of the state machine. So here's our component. It's kind of a pop-in of the component. It's just showing some properties and the constructor. So some of the properties on this component would be something like to-dos, which we're just setting equal to whatever this.store is. The store property here is basically just using DI, dependency injection from Angular, to get access to my store, like my store repository of global data, right? That we talked about, and I'm getting access to that through dependency injection with NgRx. So I'm just asking for that store, that property, and getting access to that data where I can select things off of it and dispatch actions into it as well. That store service there, you actually need to pass it like what state you're going to be looking at. In most cases, it's going to be like your global app state, but if you're in a feature, it might be something different as well. We go deeper into like feature state and all that kind of stuff for class, but the documentation covers it pretty well as well. So making use of that store service, we can actually select data out of our store using our actual selectors we just made in the previous slide, right? And we do that by actually piping off of the store. It's kind of like it's an observable, right? Making use of some RxJS syntax there. Call the select operator, which comes from NgRx/store. Just a kind of a simple select operator. And then we pass in whatever our selector was. Don't need to call it, don't need to do anything with that, just pass in the selector and then the magic will kind of happen. And at that point, your property, like to-dos or to-do count or whatever, is going to be an observable of that store state, that state that you just selected with your selector. The reason why it's an observable, you're probably wondering like, hey, you just mentioned like, hey, we're getting rid of magic here, no RxJS at all. It's not entirely true. There's still some RxJS when you consume the data, and there's some RxJS on the effects side. It's all still technically asynchronous data. It's just a lot of it gets hand waved away when you're doing like the reducers and the actions and the selectors and all that good stuff. But realistically, the data is still going to be observables whenever you kind of point it out, because you're constantly having events flowing through your system, those actions flowing through your system that produce new results of the data constantly. So you want to use observables, you want to use RxJS so you kind of get the new state of the world whenever any of the data changes. So in my case, my to-dos observable is going to be the representation of the asynchronous data that is the to-do list. And then I can simply async pipe that in my template, subscribe to it, do whatever I need to do with that data. The same thing goes with to-do count. It's going to be an observable of a number. And then is last to do is going to be an observable of a Boolean. And then is last to do is an example of passing in that custom configuration data to your selector there. It's just going to be that second parameter. It could be an object, a number, a string, whatever. But it's kind of adding in extra configuration to that business logic of the selector. All right, so that covers the selector side of things. Taking a look at the constructor here, we can see that we can actually dispatch actions as well. So we call the store.dispatch function, call our create to do function, our action function, pass it whatever data it needs, and then it pops into the store, runs through the reducers, et cetera, et cetera. So dispatching actions is actually pretty straightforward. You just call the function, pass it the action as you call it, give it the data, and you're done. Okay, so taking a quick look at effects real quick. I'm not going to go too much into the business logic of the effect, but I do want to touch on how effects kind of work. So effects are usually kind of situated inside your services. You get access to something called the actions dependency injection object. This is basically a representation of all the actions flowing through your system. This is kind of what the reducers use under the hood to kind of perform their business logic and whatnot. They get access to that stream of actions flowing through your store and your system. So again, what you can do is make use of a create effect function, right? Just making use of these creator functions. You pass it a function, so an arrow function here that points to an observable. And then here you can pipe off of the actions observable, which again is just a stream of all the action flowing through your system. The of type function here allows you to kind of filter out what actions you want to look at. It's kind of like the on function for your reducer, but it's more for the effect side on the RxJS side of things. So the of type just filters out to only looking at load to do actions. So whenever someone dispatches a load to do action, I will switch map off of that, go run my load all to dos observable function, gather all that stuff, map off of it. And eventually this effect is going to return back an action into my system so that it can kind of complete that loop, right? And in my case, whenever I want to dispatch an action back into my system, I'm mapping off of the load all to dos observable and creating a load to do success. Or if like I get a 400 error from my API or something, I will catch error and return back a load to do's error action. So kind of being more verbose with your actions can be pretty useful as well, especially with effects. That way you kind of cover all scenarios as well, maybe present an error in the UI or whatever you need to do in terms of catching those errors or just dealing with the happy state as well. Right, so those are the effects. Again, not diving too deep into the code. I just kind of want to show off some snippets here and there of what things you possibly will see on a day-to-day. If you want to dive really, really deep in stuff and work on that, I recommend an NgRx course, looking at the docs. There's a lot of other good articles as well on the internet, but that kind of gives you a general overview of what's going on there. So next, we're going to take a look at kind of an example application, kind of run through it a little bit quickly, just to make sure we have time for everything. But it's basically an application that represents a soccer team and all their stats, right? So we have access to the players and the games. We saw the state here of my app state. So we have access to a games list, a players list, a shots list, and a cards list. Now, first off, you might be thinking, hey, he just mentioned earlier that there's a cool like extra API library that works really, really well with lists of objects, lists of entities, right? So this application actually makes good use of the entity library, right? So whenever we need to perform business logic or like remove things, select things, find things, edit things inside our lists, we can make use of that entity library to make things a lot easier. But this application basically just has a lot of functionality towards lists, right? We display stuff in tables using our selectors, have lists of players on the side here of just their names. I can add people, right? So let's say, I don't know, I work with John Bauer a lot, so let's add him. All right, so we have John Bauer in there as well. So I can add people. When I go into my games, I can look at my scrimmages, right? And see all the data presented in different fashions, right? Different tables, different things. I can add new games. I can remove stuff. If I want to, I could delete this game, right? And I'm performing a lot of CRUD operations. And this is actually going back to an app backend as well. It's not just front-end data. It's interacting with a backend as well. So all this kind of stuff is extremely possible and extremely, I wouldn't say easy necessarily, but it's a lot more straightforward and a lot easier to kind of implement with NgRx as well, instead of just kind of rolling your own solution, which can get pretty complicated if you're doing like behavior subjects, all that kind of stuff. Now, here are kind of the takeaways from this application I want to focus on. Realistically, what we do is we use effects to kind of initially load data. There's something I didn't realistically talk about, but it's called the effects initializer, or whatever the actual action is called. But essentially, you can use that, hook into that, and actually just load data at the start of your application, fill in your actual data from the backend, maybe load some to-dos, load some players, load some games, all that good stuff, right? Whenever your application boots up. And then any component that needs that data can just draw on it from a selector. We also use effects to perform CRUD to the backend, right? So effects are going to be doing a lot of our asynchronous work and persisting things to the backend, loading data back into the front end as well, into our store as need be. So effects are mostly performing a lot of the CRUD operations as well. And then we also saw that there's a bunch of different screens here of different types of tables and whatnot, especially with the games as well. There's a whole bunch of different tables. The selectors are doing a lot of work inside this application to have like different viewpoints and different transformations of our data so that we can display things in tables, display things in simple lists, all this kind of stuff. And the components just use a simple selector, get the data, throw it onto the template. It's nice and straightforward and simple. I already mentioned this, but Entity manages, updates, edits, deletes, all the stuff to the list of data as well. So that's going on there as well. And then the most important thing I kind of want to take away from this application is the store is more or less being used as like a client-side cache of data, right? A lot of our stuff is instantly being persisted to a backend and API as well. So front end's mostly just a cache of data that's being updated as need be based on our CRUD operations to our backend. Now, NgRx also performs really well as one, just as a cache. It's awesome for that, maybe syncing with a socket connection or something like that. It's a nice, simple API for people to use in their components with their selectors, cool. Makes the team and developer ecosystem a little bit better. But it's also really good for applications, which I don't have an example of here, unfortunately, that have like large configuration as well. So maybe you have a lot of different forms, a lot of different steps, and then you don't actually save anything to the backend until like this culmination of data is finally done and transformed in a right way. So NgRx does a really good job with like configuration apps, configurator apps as well. So just wanted to throw that in there as well. Real quick, I'm gonna answer this question. That's a good question from Victor again. Do you need to unsubscribe from selectors, right? So selectors, again, just return back actual observables, right? So yeah, if you need to unsubscribe to them, but if you're using like async pipe and that stuff, which I would really recommend, it's one thing we kind of tout in our Angular boot camps a lot is making use of that async pipe. That kind of automatically unsubscribes for you automatically. So I'd really make use of that as well. But yeah, it's an observable. You need to do your general observable hygiene as well in your components if need be. Okay, let's get to the negative side. So this has been all positives of NgRx for the most part. There's got to be some caveats. There's got to be some trade-offs, right? It can't just be all hunky-dory, right? So some of the caveats and trade-offs are essentially there's a larger upfront learning curve, right? Angular itself is already kind of a big learning curve. There's just a lot of stuff. It's an all tools kind of in the box solution. NgRx just kind of expands on that, right? There's a lot of API, there's reducers, there's effects, there's actions, there's selectors, there's all this extra stuff being added in to manage your state across your application. So again, it's just more of a learning curve. I think it's worth it, in my opinion, for a lot of enterprise applications because there's a lot of good trade-offs as well for on the team side of consistency and just having better code readability and better transfer of knowledge across applications and teams. But again, that's kind of a downfall too. It's a little bit of a larger learning curve. It's also not a great fit sometimes for a lot of applications. If you have an application that's really just all forms and you're instantly taking the result of that form and throwing it up to an API, maybe NgRx might not be the correct fit for you, right? It might still be good for some caching of some client-side data, but if you're just all forms all the time and you're instantly posting stuff up to an API, it might not be a real use for it. We've actually had some clients where we've kind of like had to back them off of NgRx a little bit because they were overusing it. You know, it's not a, it ends up becoming like a one hammer smashes every solution, every problem you have, and it's not meant to solve every single problem in Angular, right? It's meant to solve your global shared state management solutions. Again, along that point of stuff, it's also overly complicated at times for small applications as well, right? It's a very big hammer. If you have a small application, if you can just get by with routing state, form state, maybe some simple services or component state, I would go that path. But once you start getting into larger applications, more enterprise level applications, right? A lot of complex state, a lot of global shared state, NgRx can really start to shine. Again, just making use of Angular's native state management techniques as well. Don't forget about those. NgRx is an addition to those tools that are already in the box with Angular. And then again, downside for a lot of people, I guess, is having to know having actual solid foundational knowledge for RxJS as well comes in handy, because you still got to deal with effects, right? If you want to take your state, go back to an API, go back to a database or whatever, you still got to know how to do RxJS. You still got to do proper observable hygiene in your components with those observables. So you still got to know a little bit, but you don't have to go as deep as like learning behavior subjects and all that complicated stuff. You just got to know how to use your pipelines using switch maps, merge maps, things like that. But still, you got to learn that stuff and kind of have a decent foundational knowledge there on top of learning NgRx and all this stuff already. All right, so those are kind of some of the trade-offs. Not too bad, I would say, but again, it's just more stuff you got to learn on top of Angular, and it might not be the right fit depending on your application. We can always help with that. If you need to contact us, let us know, ask questions, right? Get some feedback on whether or not NgRx could actually fit you. And before you dive too deep and kind of get situated in a, I wouldn't say a bad situation, but maybe NgRx is not the right fit and it's kind of making you tear your hair out a little bit more than you need to. If you just want like a simpler solution or it's kind of dedicated towards your application. Okay, so that's mostly the end of the spiel. Again, my contact information is on the slide if you need to contact me. My email, LinkedIn, Twitter, all that stuff is pretty good. If you want to make some issues on my GitHub projects, feel free to do that. Again, just taking a look at our upcoming training schedule, right? We offer a lot of public stuff, a lot of public free stuff, along as well as having our actual training that is actually paid for. Most of it's online right now, but we also do in-person events once things kind of settle down and it's safe to do that again. We have our Angular clinic that's actually starting in about 10 minutes or so. So feel free to hop over there. I'll probably be in there for a little bit. I believe Rachel and David are in that, and they're both awesome, really high-level experts with Angular and a lot of other good stuff inside the Angular ecosystem as well. So if you have any questions, talk to them, get some stuff answered, or just feel free to just chit-chat around about Angular. It's always fun as well. We also have our Code Talk Teaches coming up, general Angular bootcamp stuff. Angular for Architects, again, I kind of want to spout that out. It's a really good course just for high-level architect stuff. We cover NgRx a little bit as well. And there, state management solutions, what might be right for you in your application. So feel free to check out that class. And just other general good stuff as well. We have NgRx classes, RxJS classes, Cypress classes, all that good stuff, along with our free content as well. If anyone needs these slides, I have a short URL up there just because it's easier to type in than a long, super long thing, but there's also a QR code as well. You can snap a picture of that and it works pretty well. But for now, it looks like we're going to spend probably the last 9 or so minutes looking at Q&A questions. So feel free to start popping that thing open. It should be more towards the top of the screen. Right. So feel free to pop that open. I'll start running through some of these questions and see where we go with that. So it should be just kind of like a thing towards the top of your screen. It says Q&A. You can post your questions and we'll start going through those. So someone mentioned that recently NgRx kind of deprecated the using like store.select function versus actually just doing selectors themselves as an operator. They're kind of hopping back and forth with that a lot. I agree. The current way to do it right now is kind of doing the store.pipe with the select operator, but it looks like they might be going back to the store.select function as well. So we'll have to kind of pay attention to that, keep up with the NgRx updates, looking at the docs, etc. So keep an eye on that. Looks like Kyle asks, is there a way to reuse any NgRx stuff like actions, stores, etc. across multiple projects? Typically what I recommend doing that is like if you're using something like an NX mono repo, having like your NgRx stuff stored in some separate libraries can be really good. Otherwise, typically a lot of your actions, your stores, your reducers, all that kind of stuff, your selectors is just pure TypeScript code. So that can be pretty easily transferred from project to project, whether it's being stored in like an npm repository or an npm module library, you can do that. Again, it's all transferable code. It's just pure TypeScript at the end of the day that has the NgRx dependencies, a few imports here and there. But since it's pure TypeScript, very easy to kind of hop between project to project, share that code. It's also really easy to unit test as well, just kind of as a side point to point out there. Alrighty. Just again, want to throw out my contact information. If anyone has any questions, things come up later, you just want to get into contact with me, start discussions saying like, hey, is NgRx right for me? We'll always more than happy to talk about that stuff with you guys. Let's take a look at some of these other stuff. So is it possible to use local storage to keep state after reload? That's a good question. So that came in from Eduardo. So that is a good question. So a lot of times I've seen people do kind of reducers and events, like so maybe effects as well, that whenever you update some state in your actual store, you also cache it away into local storage as well. And what you can do is whenever you do like that initial state, if I go back to my slides here, if you see the reducer here, we have that initial state of an empty array. You could actually just take in the state, the data that's stored inside the like either cookies or local storage or whatever session storage. You can bring that in as well as your default starting state. So yeah, it links in pretty well. Again, this is just a pure TypeScript file, so you can just grab that data and plug it in as the initial value as well. So yeah, that works pretty well. Is there a way to use a parameterized selector? Yeah, so I went through it a little fast, but parameterized selectors allow you just kind of pass in some extra data, like our index number here, just going to be that second argument of the selector function here. They allow you to perform some extra business logic, extra configuration data to do that stuff as well. I think someone just mentioned in chat, there's an NgRx local storage library. I think it's from someone in the community. So that might be something to check out as well. And then from the component side here, you can see that whenever you pass in that data here on the select, it's just going to be the second parameter as well. So Kyle asks, if I use NgRx, how does kind of reduce the amount of people needed to do detailed RxJS work? On my current client project, actually, we kind of have a situation of this. So typically the people that are dealing with the effects and actually performing like the CRUD operations and all that kind of more asynchronous stuff are the people that are very more oriented towards the actual problem domain of the data. So kind of like the more backend oriented people, right? And then they do a lot of the stuff, setting up the effects, it's syncing in with actions to perform that logic. They deal more with the effects, RxJS side. And then a lot of the run-of-the-mill developers on your teams that are dealing with components, making the UI, architecting that stuff and making the features themselves and displays, the only thing they really need to deal with is the observables from the selections, right? They select the data, they throw it on the screen with maybe an async pipe or something, maybe do some very basic conversions, but a lot of that should be carried out with the selectors. So the people that are setting up the NgRx might have a little bit more with RxJS, but the people that are just consuming it don't need to use as much as well. So Victor asked, does page refreshing disrupt the NgRx state? Yeah. So NgRx is completely client side. Whenever you refresh your application and it boots up again, all of that is cleared. So you will need to repopulate things either using effects to load stuff in from a backend, or maybe using something like local storage as well to kind of persist your state. Yeah, that's a good question. So currently, I have to fire an action from my component to load the data before I use a selector to pull the data out of the store. Okay, so that's kind of a initial pattern that I've seen in a lot of projects is, hey, I want to load some data once I get to this page. What can I do? A lot of times you want to actually make use of your effects to load data, actually. You can use the effects initializer. There's an action there. We could actually maybe look at it inside the docs. Effects initializer, NgRx. I can type app initializer is what it's called, I guess. Either way, basically just make use of the root effects init action, and then you can kind of just load in data whenever your application boots up, whenever your feature boots up. You can also load in stuff if you're making use of that router store as well. So like as you get to certain pages, maybe if a route param or a query param changes, it's then when you go fetch data. And then as long as you're using like your selectors and things like that, making it all asynchronous, it'll all flow towards the template anyways. So maybe you throw a loading spinner or something up while the observable is still null, but once that data is populated, then it's actually displayed on screen. So yeah, I would definitely look into using effects more to load your data as well. Yeah, so Kyle asked, NgRx is a lot easier and less verbose than it used to be. So that's a good statement. This stuff used to be a little bit more complicated. It used to have a lot more raw TypeScript code. Recently, NgRx opted more towards the creator pattern with functions, right? So using create feature selector, create reducer, create action, makes for an easier flow of data versus the older style, I think which was prior to NgRx 8, I believe, was when this stuff started coming in. So yeah, it's a lot easier nowadays. There's a lot less boilerplate code, a lot less stuff you need to remember in terms of being like an NgRx guru. It's a lot easier to pick up nowadays, making use of these functions, and the docs are a lot better as well. So I think we're gonna answer this one last question. So Bo asks, is there a good way to kind of integrate selectors with actions and effects? So say I kicked off an action or maybe wanted to look at some data, but it's not there or not existent yet, then I kind of want to load in the data. Typically what I recommend there is just, what you can typically do is like maybe on your component side or maybe the effects service side, you can maybe kick off an action to say, hey, I've got onto the screen. I'm going to be paying attention with my selector to the data in the store. So maybe kick off an action to say, hey, go ahead and check to see if this data is populated with an effect. If it's not, then go ahead and do like a CRUD option or read option from the backend or your local storage or whatever. That could work. Instead of just having your effect be based on an action, you could also have your effects be based off of other observables as well. You don't just have to use the actions observable as your baseline for the effect. You could also use sockets. You could use other observables, selectors, and things like that if you need to, base it off of some state changes as well. Those work as well. So I'd recommend looking into that kind of a pattern, not only using the actions as a base for your effect, but using other things like store selections and stuff like that as well. Just be a little bit careful with that. You don't want to enter into like infinite loops, which is very possible with that pattern. So just be a little bit careful, take it slow, only use it when you really need to. But yeah, you can do stuff like that as well.